So my paper is Two Stories Tangled Together, The Double Brain, Pudd'n'head Wilson, and Those Extraordinary Twins. And I'm gonna stumble over extraordinary every single time I say it, so we'll deal with that too. Since we have a little bit of time, actually, I'll start with a story about sort of how I got to this subject. There was a book that was released in 2019 called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist. It's so talking about the two hemispheres of the brain. The idea behind it is that one of them, which I'm not going to say which one's which right now, but one of them is sort of the master, sort of overseeing everything, kind of having like a broad view of the world, whereas the other hemisphere is more appropriate to pay attention to like specific tasks that you need to do, you know, pressing a button, or he uses the example of a bird picking up seeds. So the bird has to be paying attention to how to pick the seed up from the ground, but also paying attention to the world to see if there's anything that's a danger or maybe a potential mate out there that is interesting. So sort of two visions of the world. So I happened to be reading this book at the same time that I was doing my comprehensive list readings, so I came across PUDD'NHEAD WILSON, and that's sort of where these similarities came from. I was surprised to see, maybe you've heard of the idea of like I don't want to confuse them, the right hemisphere of the brain being the creative side and the left hemisphere being sort of the logical side. So this is kind of like a common stereotype that we have. And I was surprised to see that there's similar sorts of research about that in the 19th century. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. But I'll start the proper presentation now. Okay. It is well known that Mark Twain first conceived of the story that would evolve into Pudd'n'head Wilson and Those Extraordinary Twins after seeing an advertisement for the Tochi twins, a pair of conjoined twins from Italy who toured the United States for 5 years, beginning in 1891. In Twain's version, the twins are Angelo and Luigi, two Italian brothers who are conjoined in the farcical Those Extraordinary Twins, but separate identical twins in the revised drama Pudd'n'head Wilson. The drama also features another twinned pair, the black child Chambers and his young master Tom, who are switched as infants by Chambers' mother to give him a better life. Moreover, all of these twins are enclosed by Twain's decision to publish the stories together, turning the narrative into its own conjoined entity. Such proliferation of twinning and conjoining suggests that we look deeper into Twain's interest in the emergent fields of psychology and the subconscious, especially as evidenced by his essays on telegraphy and his role as a founding member in the American Society of Psychical Research in 1884. The germ of these tales, to borrow Henry James's term, is certainly the Tochi twins. But the conjoined status of the twins and the stories themselves move beyond that germ toward the nature of another twin pair that was popular in the 19th century, the hemispheres of the brain. Throughout this presentation, I will read the conjoined twins in Those Extraordinary Twins and the conjoined stories themselves as models of different 19th century theories of the double brain. The basic structure of my presentation follows 3 parts. So first, I'm going to summarize the major theories of the double brain in the 19th century. Second, I look at the twins Angelo and Luigi and the resemblance of these theories. Third, and I think most importantly, I read the 2 stories, Pudd'n'head Wilson and the so-called first draft of Those Extraordinary Twins, as further models of doubleness like the dual brain. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts about why I think this reading matters for looking at Twain and looking at reading in general. So first, we begin by looking at different theories of the dual hemispheric structure of the brain in the 19th century. While the general structure of the brain had been known for centuries, at least since the human brain was able to be dissected in the Renaissance, in the 19th century, researchers began to theorize the dual structure in particular. One of the strongest opinions was by Arthur Ladbrokes Wigan, who in his 1844 book, The Duality of the Mind, argued that an individual human brain contains 2 distinct minds. For Wigan, the 2 hemispheres of the brain are always in some degree of conflict, working to wrest control from the other. For man has 2 brains in one skull. Sometimes one has the command, and sometimes the other. The 2 minds continuously alternate control over the entire body, such that the effective relationship between the 2 hemispheres, along with coordination between the mind and the body, are the foundation of one's mental health. In the healthy human, Wigan explains, these 2 minds cohabit the brain comfortably, working together to achieve common ends. But in the unhealthy human, exhibiting signs of madness, these 2 minds are in conflict. The risk, then, is allowing what British psychologist Henry Maudsley calls a brute brain within the man's, to control the entire person. Since this brute brain always threatens to seize control, each rational human is ethically responsible for maintaining their logical reasoning. That is, Wiggins states that everyone must work to train up and maintain the rational side of their brain, otherwise they risk madness. Later in the 19th century, different examinations at multiple personalities and hidden seats of memory and personality returned to the question of multiple minds in a single brain. Perhaps the most famous example of this research in the 19th century is with the French psychologists Jean-Martin Charcot and Pierre Janet. One of Janet's patients, named Leonie in the reporting, seemed to have 3 distinct personalities, each that had a continuance of memory that extended only to the moment where that personality was in control of the body and the mind. Other European researchers, such as Max Dressor, suggested that there exists a double self, or in the German, the Doppel-Ich, so it's the same word that Freud uses for ego. So a double self in the typical human mind that reveals a subconscious intelligence, or a subconscious memory. These theories influenced F.W.H. Myers, who argued in his serialized text, The Subliminal Consciousness, that the stream of consciousness in which we habitually live is not the only consciousness which exists in connection with our organism. Our habitual or empirical consciousness may consist of a mere selection from a multitude of thoughts and sensations, of which some are equally conscious with those we empirically know. For Myers, the ordinary waking self is dominant only because it has shown itself to be the fittest to meet the needs of common life. Yet, Myers' primary argument is that this dominance should not overshadow the importance of the various subliminal levels of consciousness below the surface. Now, it's likely that Twain was at least familiar with Myers' theories, for they were both founding members of the American Society of Psychical Research. The founder, William James, was deeply interested in what he called consciousness beyond the margin, which is this vague awareness that lies outside of your mainstream attention. From the European studies on hysteria, James grew interested in what Janet calls the doubling of consciousness, into different states that seem to occur in the mind simultaneously. Phenomena like automatic writing, partial anesthesia, sleepwalking, and multiple personalities made manifest, for James, the ability for the human body to contain multitudes beyond the singular stream of thought that we typically associate with our introspective self. The French experiments on hysteric patients demonstrate how the singular stream of consciousness can suddenly be, in James's word, interrupted from the depths by a wave that rises to the surface, swamps the other waves, overflows the banks, deflects for a while the course of the current, and then as suddenly subsides, so that the stream resumes its natural course. And here you can see the similarities to his stream of thought, stream of consciousness idea. James finds the sources of this disturbance in what he calls some other stream running alongside the one disturbed, suggesting that our understanding of all consciousness, not just those in hysteria, is far too limited and narrow. Now, as a brief aside, I don't want to emphasize this too much, but it's just maybe a little bit too speculative, but it's worth noting that both Twain and James were together in Florence, Italy, during the winter of 1892, the same year that Myers had released The Subliminal Consciousness, and only 2 years after James published The Principles of Psychology. And James did write in a letter to his colleague at Harvard, Josiah Royce, that Mark Twain is here for the winter in a villa outside of town, hard at work, writing something or other. I've seen him a couple times, and he says a little bit more about his southern drawl. Now, based on the timing, we know at least one of these something or others was those extraordinary twins. So it's conceivable, perhaps even likely, that the two of them, both being interested in psychical research and psychology, would have discussed different theories of the brain, different research into hysteria, and other themes that I'm outlining here. Now, my argument doesn't depend on that, but I just think it's interesting and worth noting that they were both there at the same time. Okay, so now getting into the novel. The clearest image of Angelo and Luigi as models of the dual structure of the human brain comes in Those Extraordinary Twins, where they appear conjoined. Twain wasn't the first to actually suggest a connection between conjoined twins and the human brains. In 1980, the same year as James's principles, French physician Gabriel Descartes argued that what happens in conjoined twins with separate brains, spinal cords, and peripheral nervous systems is merely an exaggerated version of what happens in the normal human brain. Each of these two hemispheres has a unique personality. Even the Scientific American notice of the Tochi's twins' tour of the United States similarly describes the twins as physically connected but mentally distinct. They are able to stand but have not yet succeeded in walking, as each leg is governed by its own brain. Luigi and Angelo in Those Extraordinary Twins are able to walk, but not from coordinated maneuvering of the two individually governed legs. Instead, Twain's conjoined twins function like Wiggins' description of the normal human. The two minds alternate control over the shared body, just as the two halves of the brain in Wiggins' construction alternate control over the entire body. Still, Angelo and Luigi also coordinate their actions, becoming more productive in physical tasks due to their robust interdependence. When they drink coffee or eat potatoes, for example, the twins simultaneously assist each other with a system of signs which nobody can notice or understand but ourselves. The conjoined twins are merely an exploded version of the internal communication inherent in any human with a dual brain in Wiggins' model. Their strength comes from their ability to work together to make up for each other's deficits and for each other's unique personalities, all while this threat of competition lingers. While Angelo and Luigi are coordinated and interdependent, Twain also frequently shows them to have unique personalities that are temperamentally opposed, if not outright antagonistic. Luigi is a free thinker, a drinker, and a smoker. Angelo is a Methodist turned Baptist and a teetotaler. The two twins resemble Wiggins' description of the dual mind in every human, where with one brain, a man is a hypocritical knave, and with the other, a fanatical enthusiast. According to 19th century thought, a person's outward personality is dependent on which half of the brain was dominant. With the conjoined twins, Luigi is obviously dominant over his more fanatical brother. He remains hardy, whereas Angelo is sickly, and Luigi often makes decisions for himself without considering Angelo, since Angelo is the weaker of the two. Though Angelo apparently tries to cooperate with his brother, Luigi is much less considerate when, for example, he has control over the legs. So Angelo complains, "I often consult your wishes, but you never consult mine. When I am in command, I treat you as a guest. I try to make you feel at home. When you are in command, you treat me as an intruder. You make me feel unwelcome." Other choices that Luigi makes unilaterally negatively affect Angelo. When Luigi duels Tom, Angelo is the one who's struck with the bullets. When Luigi drinks or smokes, Angelo is the one who feels drunk or coughs from the tobacco. And in the humorous finale of the farce, Luigi is hanged, leading to Angelo's death necessarily, in an apparent allusion to the witticism that gave David Wilson his Pudd'n'head nickname, that he would kill his half the dog of a loudly barking dog. Thus, if one twin has to resemble the passive right hemisphere, then it's certainly Angelo. Now, to talk about the two tails. These allusions between the twins and the duality of the brain, I think, are interesting enough. But Twain pushes his composition even further by twinning and conjoining the stories themselves into a single interdependent publication. Just as Luigi was dominant over Angelo, Pudd'n'head Wilson seems like the more dominant of the two stories. This tale feels more complete, and Twain simply refers to that version to fill in missing descriptions of events that happen in Those Extraordinary Twins. Since Pudd'n'head Wilson is a drama, the characters appear more logical, more reasonable, more like the true versions of themselves, whereas those in the shorter farce are merely what was left behind after what Twain calls his literary Caesarean operation. His language here, I think, is misleading, for the stories were never fully separated, as would have to occur in a Caesarean section. Instead, they exist together, connected in title by the and, as well as in the narrative of the preface and the final remarks of Those Extraordinary Twins. So this is less a Caesarean and more of a conjoining. This operation forms sinews that resemble not an umbilical cord, but the corpus callosum, the bundle of white matter that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Just as this bridge between the hemispheres allows for communication, the publishing of the two stories together allows both to interact, such as when Twain uses descriptions of events from one tale to complete the narrative of the other. Current research also suggests that the corpus callosum has an inhibitory function. So this is where one half of the brain can basically shut down parts of the other half of the brain so that they can have the total control over whatever that would be. So eyesight or reading comprehension, these sorts of things. Similarly, Twain describes Those Extraordinary Twins as the suppressed farce, being inhibited by the dominance of Pudd'n'head Wilson. The suppression works in reverse too, for Twain's inclusion of Those Extraordinary Twins in the same publication undermines the seriousness of the drama. Twain, in other words, uses these texts to undermine traditional expectations of serious fiction, choosing instead to highlight the subversive nature of those narrative strands that are typically hidden by the more dominant account. So to uncritically accept the dominance of Pudd'nhead Wilson over those extraordinary twins as the result of Twain's sequential composition of the stories would ignore this more complex subversive operation that Twain's enacting in these stories. Scholars have shown how Twain's narrative of revision in A Whisper to the Reader and the preface to those extraordinary twins does not reflect the revision process as it actually occurred. By describing the two stories as tangled together, Twain does not give a realistic portrayal of his writing process, but instead, as Kara A. Johnson explains, he sets the stage for describing the revision process as a physically violent struggle to achieve narrative authority. Through the lens of revision as a violent struggle, Twain aligns his writing with other violent struggles that appear just behind the main action of the stories, such as Roxy's life of slavery, her switching of the infants Tom and Chambers, and many more. Yet, neither version of the tale is completely independent of the other, and often in those extraordinary twins, the narrator refers to the action in Pudd'nhead Wilson to flesh out the story. Thus, while Twain says he chooses the story in Pudd'nhead Wilson over the farce, his inclusion of those extraordinary twins in the ambiguous intermingling of the two stories in a single volume actually resembles his commitment to taking any possible narrative strand seriously, a feature he likely picked up from his interest in psychical research. Okay, so I want to step back and consider what this actually does to our reading of this text and other texts by Twain. While the similarity between Twain's conjoined twins and the neurological science and 19th century psychological theories is interesting, the greater payoff lies in what Twain reveals about literary practice more generally. In the conjoined stories of Pudd'nhead Wilson and those extraordinary twins, Twain engages with these scientific theories to formulate an environment where division and connection are necessary. In other words, the focal point between the interpretive process lies in the betweenness, between the stories, between the text and the reader, and between the hemispheres of the brain. Twain pretends that the stories are discrete and independent, saying in the final remarks after those extraordinary twins that their story was one story, the new people's story was another story, and there was no connection between them, no interdependence, no kinship. Yet there clearly are connections between the stories. Twain's decision to publish them together essentially begs the reader to find the connections that are being hinted at by this statement. Therefore, I argue that Twain enacts in a single publication what is already occurring within any mind. Neither version of the tale, just as neither hemisphere's discrete vision of the environment, is more correct or representative of reality. But instead, the most complete vision is the one that imagines both together. The complete vision is one that oscillates back and forth, allowing limited attention to alternate between both versions of the story, while keeping this interpretive process going. We must not settle into one hemisphere or the other, just as Twain encourages us not to settle into one version of the story or the other. Of course, this continual spiraling precludes formulating any satisfying ending for those who demand it. So judging the two stories to be unreadable, Herschel Parker and Henry Binder, for example, criticized the story's lack of an ending, saying, given the fact that what Mark Twain took out of the manuscript as Pudd'nhead Wilson contains unreconciled contradictions, probably no ending could have genuinely closed the book. For Parker and Binder, this unsatisfactory ending is a flaw, but such a requirement misses the circular notion of the book and the fact that these unreconciled contradictions are features of Twain's attempt to encourage the reader to continue finding new interpretive connections between the stories. For Twain, the unique composition of the two stories allows the reading process to be, in McGilchrist's word, forever in motion, never settling down and maintaining a perpetual newness. Thank you.